Paramedics rushed to save a dying boy but encountered an unexpected obstacle. Police officers blocked their way, endangering the child's life. What happened next will shock you. Sign up and get the whole story, right where you're watching from. The call came in sharp and clear, slicing through the muted hum of the ambulance station. Leah's hand instinctively darted toward the radio, her fingers steady and practiced as she caught the details relayed in clipped, urgent tones. "We've got a teenage male, trapped under rubble," the dispatcher's voice crackled over the line. "Collapsed structure on the west end, near the old factory district." Leah felt a familiar surge of adrenaline mixed with the heavy weight of responsibility. She glanced across the ambulance bay to where James, her partner, was already loading up their equipment. He was silent but focused, his face betraying the same determination she felt in her own heart. Together, they had been through enough calls to know that time was now their greatest enemy. They exchanged a brief nod, a mutual understanding built on years of shared moments in life or death situations. James climbed behind the wheel, and as soon as Leah joined him, they pulled out of the station, lights and sirens blazing, cutting through the evening fog that hung low over the streets. As the city blurred past, they sat in silence, each lost in their thoughts. The rhythmic flashing of the emergency lights reflected off nearby buildings, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to chase the ambulance through the narrow streets. The sirens pierced the quiet of the early evening, a sound that had long since become part of Leah's life, a constant reminder of why she had chosen this path. Leah finally broke the silence. "Another kid caught up in this mess," she muttered, half to herself, half to James. James, his hands tight on the wheel, glanced sideways at her. "It doesn't get any easier, does it?" His voice was calm, but Leah could sense the tension hidden beneath his words. Despite his steady demeanor, she knew that he carried his own burdens, the memories of lives saved and lives lost, each one adding a quiet weight to his conscience. "No," Leah replied softly, "it never does." Her mind drifted, unbidden, to the streets she had grown up on, not far from the very neighborhood they were racing toward. She had seen so many of her friends slip through the cracks, caught in the grinding gears of a system that seemed designed to let them down. She had chosen this path because she had refused to let herself be another victim, another statistic. And now, years later, she fought for every life she could save, a silent rebellion against the injustices she had known too well. As they sped through a red light, narrowly avoiding a late commuter, James spoke again, this time his voice softer. "It's not just the kid under the rubble, you know. It's the families, the friends, the people around them who'll carry this for the rest of their lives." Leah nodded. She had seen it too often, the ripple effects of tragedy spreading far beyond the immediate pain. "People think we just save lives," she said, a hint of bitterness creeping into her voice. "They don't see what it does to us when we can't. They don't understand how much we carry." A silence settled over them again, heavier this time. The ambulance roared through the empty streets, each moment drawing them closer to the unknown, to a boy trapped under tons of concrete and twisted steel. In her mind, Leah relived moments from her past that had driven her to this line of work. She remembered the first time she had seen a paramedic pull her neighbor's child from a car wreck, the way the paramedic's hands had been gentle but firm, the way he had spoken in low, calming tones. That moment had stayed with her through all the tough years that followed, and she had clung to it when everything else had felt hopeless. James, too, seemed lost in thought. Leah knew some of his story, enough to understand the pain and resilience that had shaped him, He had grown up watching his family face prejudice and injustice, had seen the harsh realities that came with being on the wrong side of society's expectations. He had chosen medicine not just as a career, but as a personal mission, a way to push back against the hate he had witnessed. Every life he saved was, in his eyes, an act of defiance against a world that had too often been unkind. "Do you ever wonder," he began, breaking the silence, "if things will ever change? If we'll ever live in a world where people like us don't have to fight just to be seen, to be trusted?" Leah's gaze remained fixed on the road ahead. "I used to," she admitted. "I used to believe that if we did enough, if we saved enough lives, maybe people would start to see us differently. But now?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Now, I'm not so sure." James glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe the change isn't out there," he said quietly. "Maybe it's in here." He tapped a finger against his chest. "Maybe the people we save are the ones who'll carry the torch, who'll be the difference in the end." Leah let his words sink in as they turned the corner and finally saw the remnants of the collapsed building looming ahead, a dark and ominous shape against the fading light. Crowds had gathered, their faces anxious and fearful. Some held phones, recording the scene, while others clutched at each other, whispering and pointing. Leah took a deep breath, steeling herself for the task ahead. "Whatever happens," she said, glancing at James, "we're going to get that kid out." James met her gaze, and for a moment they shared a look of mutual determination, a wordless promise forged in the fires of their shared experiences. "Let's do it," he said. They parked the ambulance as close as they could, grabbing their equipment and pushing their way through the crowd. The scene was chaotic. The remnants of the building lay scattered in twisted piles, the air thick with dust and the faint smell of smoke. Leah's heart pounded as she scanned the debris, trying to pinpoint where the boy might be trapped. The shouts of onlookers faded into the background as she focused on the task at hand. Every instinct, every bit of training she had ever received kicked in as she assessed the situation. The boy's life was in their hands, and they couldn't afford a single mistake. As they stepped closer to the rubble, Leah caught sight of a faint movement beneath a pile of broken bricks and twisted metal. She moved quickly, signaling James to follow as she knelt beside the spot, her voice steady and calm as she spoke to the trapped teenager. "Malik, can you hear me?" she called, hoping her voice would reach him through the layers of debris. A faint reply drifted back, barely audible but unmistakable. "Yeah, I'm here." Relief flooded her, but it was tempered by the knowledge of the long, difficult task ahead. Leah knew they had only a slim chance of getting Malik out unscathed, but she was prepared to fight with everything she had. She glanced over at James, who was already unrolling the stretcher and setting up their gear. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, their resolve unwavering. And, as she leaned over the rubble, speaking softly to Malik to keep him calm, she couldn't help but think that perhaps James was right. Maybe the world wouldn't change all at once. Maybe people wouldn't immediately see the work they did in a new light. But for Malik, for the life they were about to save, they were the difference. And that was all that mattered. The wreckage loomed around them like a jagged tomb. Leah squatted close to the source of the faint voice, her heart beating hard in her chest as she strained to hear every word. Malik's voice was weak, muffled under the layers of concrete and metal, but his words were enough to let them know he was still alive. Time was against them, and every second felt heavy with the weight of urgency. "Malik," Leah called again, keeping her tone calm and steady. "We're here to get you out. Just stay with us, okay?" The boy's reply was faint but filled with fear. I can't breathe." His words broke off, followed by the sound of shallow, ragged breaths. Leah bit her lip, her mind racing through possible scenarios. She looked over at James, who was already laying out the emergency equipment they would need to stabilize Malik once they could reach him. His expression was one of intense focus, his eyes never leaving the pile of debris. "We have to get him out fast, but we can't risk a collapse," Leah murmured to James, her eyes scanning the precarious mound of rubble above Malik's location. James nodded, his face set in determination. "If we work together, we can shore up the debris as we go. I'll handle the extraction. You keep him talking and make sure he doesn't lose consciousness." Leah took a deep breath, reaching down to touch the cool, gritty surface of the rubble, her fingers brushing over fragments of stone and twisted metal. She imagined what Malik must be feeling, the claustrophobic pressure of tons of debris pressing down on him, the overwhelming fear that his next breath might be his last. "Malik, we're going to start moving some things around, okay? It might get a little noisy, but we're right here with you." Her voice was gentle, soothing as she spoke, hoping her calmness would reach through the rubble and ease his fear. She could hear him struggling for breath, each inhale labored and punctuated with faint whimpers. He was trying to be brave, but Leah could sense the panic in his voice. It reminded her of herself years ago when she'd been in a similarly helpless position. The memory surfaced, unbidden, the sound of her own frightened breaths, the feeling of being trapped and alone, praying for someone to come to her aid. Pushing the memory aside, Leah focused on the task at hand. This was no time for personal reflections. Malik needed her full attention. James moved with methodical precision, his hands carefully working to shift the debris piece by piece, each movement calculated to prevent a secondary collapse. Leah stayed close, monitoring every twitch of Malik's fingers that protruded from the rubble, watching for signs of distress. She kept talking to him, her words a steady flow meant to keep him grounded. "Hey, Malik," she said softly, "do you have any brothers or sisters?" There was a pause, a slight rustling from beneath the rubble as Malik struggled to respond. A sister," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. She's at home." Leah smiled to herself, though she knew he couldn't see her. "I bet she's really worried about you right now. You've got to hang in there for her, all right? We're going to get you out so you can tell her all about how brave you were." The boy's breathing hitched, and she felt a pang of sympathy, imagining the little girl waiting for her brother, not knowing what had happened. Malik's family, his friends, they would all be desperate for news, praying that he would come out of this alive. As they worked, James and Leah fell into a rhythm, each movement precise and practiced. Years of training and countless hours spent together on calls like this had honed their teamwork to near perfection. Leah could anticipate James's next move, adjusting her position accordingly, while James trusted her to handle any medical needs that arose during the extraction. "All right," James murmured, his voice barely audible over the soft crunch of shifting debris. "We're almost there. Just a few more pieces." Leah's heart leapt at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. They were close, yes, but any wrong move could still endanger Malik. The slightest tremor could send the unstable rubble crashing down, trapping them all. Her gaze flicked to Malik's hand, fingers twitching weakly in response to her touch. "Just hold on, Malik," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "We're almost there." Bit by bit, James removed the debris, his hands steady as he shifted each piece to the side. Leah held her breath with every movement, her entire focus on Malik's faint breathing, the fragile rise and fall of his chest beneath the rubble. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they cleared enough space to see Malik's face. His skin was pale, covered in a fine layer of dust, and his eyes were wide with terror. But he was alive, and for Leah, that was all that mattered. She reached out, brushing a hand gently over his forehead, her touch light and reassuring. "Hey, Malik, we've got you. You're safe now." Malik's eyes flickered, his gaze unfocused but filled with a mix of relief and exhaustion. I thought..." His voice trailed off, too weak to finish the sentence. Leah squeezed his hand, offering him a comforting smile. "You're going to be okay. Just a little longer, and we'll have you out of here." James wasted no time, quickly positioning the stretcher and securing Malik's limbs to prevent further injury. As Leah helped stabilize him, she continued talking, her words a steady stream meant to keep him calm and grounded. "You know, Malik, you're doing amazing," she murmured, adjusting his oxygen mask. "Most people would have passed out by now, but you're holding on. That's strength, right there." Malik managed a faint, trembling smile, his eyes fluttering shut as he took a few deep breaths. I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Leah's heart clenched at his words. She had been there too, had known the cold, paralyzing grip of fear in moments like this. She wished she could take that fear from him, to let him know that he didn't have to carry it alone. "I know, Malik," she said softly, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of city noise. "But you don't have to be scared anymore. We're right here, and we're not going anywhere." Beside her, James worked quickly, his hands moving with practiced ease as he secured the final straps and prepared Malik for transport. He glanced over at Leah, his gaze filled with the same determination she felt. "Ready?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Leah nodded, taking a final look at Malik to ensure he was stable. "Let's get him out of here." They lifted the stretcher with care, their movements synchronized as they navigated the treacherous path back to the ambulance. Every step was deliberate, each one calculated to minimize any jostling that might aggravate Malik's injuries. The crowd around them parted, silent and watchful, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and relief. As they reached the ambulance, Leah climbed in first, settling beside Malik and checking his vitals one last time. His breathing was still shallow but steady, and she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. James climbed into the driver's seat, his face set with grim determination as he started the engine. As they pulled away from the scene, Leah kept her attention on Malik, her hands gentle as she adjusted his oxygen mask and checked his pulse. "You did great, Malik," she murmured, her voice soft. "We're almost at the hospital, and then the doctors will take care of the rest. You're going to be okay." Malik's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but filled with a quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Leah felt a lump form in her throat, and she blinked back the sudden surge of emotion. This was why she did this job, for moments like this, for the chance to make a difference, no matter how small. As they sped through the city streets, Leah glanced over at James, catching his eye in the rearview mirror. He gave her a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared, of the unspoken promise they had made to protect and save as many lives as they could. But she knew, deep down, that their work was far from over. Malik's rescue was just the beginning. There were still battles to fight, challenges to face, and lives to save. And as long as they were here, together, she knew they would face them head-on, no matter the cost. The ambulance lurched forward as James pressed his foot down on the accelerator, the sirens wailing into the night as they sped through the twisting city streets. Leah sat beside Malik in the back, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, feeling the faint rise and fall of his chest beneath her fingers. His breathing was shallow, each breath a small, fragile victory, but she could see the strain in his face, the pale blue tinge on his lips that told her he was fighting to hold on. The city lights flashed by, casting eerie shadows across the interior of the ambulance, flickering like ghostly reminders of the urgency pressing down on them. Leah focused on her breathing, calming herself as she checked Malik's vitals again, silently willing him to stay with her. "You're doing great, Malik," she whispered, leaning close so he could hear her over the blare of the sirens. "Just hang in there a little longer. We're getting you to the hospital." Malik's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but full of desperation. Is it far?" he asked, his voice barely audible, his words trembling with the effort. Leah forced a reassuring smile, masking the anxiety gnawing at her. "Not much farther, I promise," she said softly, though she knew that the journey could stretch on longer than she'd like. The city was notorious for its unpredictable traffic, and every red light, every car blocking their way, felt like a cruel taunt. Up front, James was weaving through the traffic with practiced skill, his eyes focused, his hands steady on the wheel. He knew as well as Leah did that every second counted. Malik's condition was deteriorating, and there was no room for error. They hit a stretch of road clear of traffic, and James took advantage of it, accelerating, pushing the ambulance to its limits. Leah braced herself, keeping a firm hold on Malik as they sped forward, the city blurring past them. She glanced at the monitors, watching the flickering numbers that indicated Malik's vitals. His oxygen levels were low, dangerously so, and his heart rate was erratic. She leaned closer, speaking softly into his ear. "Malik, I need you to take deep breaths, okay? Just like we practiced before. Breathe in slowly, then out. You're doing great." He nodded weakly, his eyes closing as he tried to follow her instructions. His breaths were shallow, uneven, but he was trying, and that was all she could ask for. "Leah," James called from the driver's seat, his voice tense. "There's a roadblock up ahead. We might need to find another way." Leah's heart skipped a beat. She glanced at the monitors again, noting the slight dip in Malik's heart rate. "How much time will that add?" she asked, keeping her tone as steady as possible, though her mind was racing. James glanced at the GPS, his jaw tightening. "A few minutes, maybe more. There's no clear path right now." She took a deep breath, struggling to keep her composure. "Do whatever you have to do, James. We can't afford to lose any more time." As he swerved around the block, taking a narrow side street that barely fit the width of the ambulance, Leah held on to Malik, whispering words of encouragement, willing him to keep fighting. The ambulance jolted as they hit a pothole, and Malik whimpered, his fingers clutching weakly at Leah's hand. She squeezed back, murmuring soothing words, though her own heart was pounding. "It's okay, Malik. Just a little bump. You're safe here with us," she said, brushing a hand over his forehead to wipe away the beads of sweat gathering there. James continued navigating the maze of back streets, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel as he fought to find the quickest route. Leah could see the strain in his face, the tightness in his jaw, and she knew he was feeling the same pressure she was. There was no room for error, no second chance. This was it. They hit another clear stretch, and James accelerated again, his eyes darting between the road and the GPS, searching for the fastest path. Leah kept her focus on Malik, watching his breathing, adjusting the oxygen mask as needed, doing everything she could to keep him stable. As they approached another intersection, James hesitated, glancing quickly at Leah through the rearview mirror. "We're going to have to push through a few lights," he said, his voice tight with resolve. Leah nodded. "Do what you have to do. I've got him." James didn't hesitate. He sped through the first light, narrowly missing a car that had started to inch forward. The driver honked, a sharp, angry sound, but James paid no attention, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Leah could feel the tension building, every nerve in her body on edge as they barreled through the city. Malik's pulse was weak beneath her fingers, his breathing growing more labored with each passing second. "Stay with me, Malik," she whispered, her voice a steady anchor in the storm of noise and motion around them. "You're almost there. Just keep breathing, okay?" He gave a faint nod, his eyes fluttering open for a brief moment before closing again. Leah felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce determination that drove away her own fear. She couldn't let him slip away. Not now. James took another sharp turn, the tires squealing as he maneuvered through a narrow alley, bypassing a line of stalled cars. The ambulance rocked, and Leah held on to Malik, steadying him as best she could. Finally, they broke free of the crowded streets, merging onto a wider road that led straight to the hospital. Leah could see the lights of the emergency entrance in the distance, a beacon of hope cutting through the darkness. "We're almost there," she said, her voice filled with relief. "Just a few more minutes, Malik. You're going to be okay." But even as she spoke, she felt a flicker of doubt. His pulse was faint, his breathing shallow. She could see the strain in his face, the way his body seemed to sag under the weight of exhaustion. He was fighting, but she could sense that he was close to his limit. The hospital loomed closer, the red and blue lights of the ambulance casting a strange glow on its facade. Leah could feel the weight of the journey pressing down on her, every second stretching out as they neared the finish line. Then, just as they were about to pull into the emergency bay, a flash of red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, and a loud voice blared through a megaphone. "Pull over. This is the police." Leah felt her heart sink as she realized what was happening. She glanced at James, who met her gaze in the mirror, his face a mask of disbelief. "Are you kidding me?" he muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "We don't have time for this." Leah looked down at Malik, his face pale and sweat-soaked, his breathing barely audible. They were so close. The hospital was just a few hundred yards away. But now, with the police blocking their path, that short distance felt like an insurmountable chasm. James slowed the ambulance, pulling over to the side of the road as the police cruiser parked behind them, its lights flashing insistently. Leah's mind raced, searching for a solution, a way to get Malik the help he needed before it was too late. She leaned forward, meeting James's gaze with a look of determination. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we're not leaving this kid." He nodded, his expression hardening. "Agreed." As the police officers approached, Leah steeled herself, ready to fight for Malik's life, to do whatever it took to get him to the hospital in time. The flashing red and blue lights cast a surreal glow over the dark street, bouncing off the ambulance windows and making Leah's heart pound with frustration. They were so close to the hospital, only a few hundred yards, but the police cruiser's lights created an impassable barrier. Every second counted, and now they were caught, forced into a situation that was both infuriating and terrifying. James clenched his hands around the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "This can't be happening." he muttered, his voice tight with disbelief and anger. "We don't have time for this." Leah looked down at Malik, his face pale and drawn, his breathing shallow. She could see the faint flicker of fear in his eyes, his gaze darting around the ambulance as if trying to make sense of what was happening. The boy's life was hanging by a thread, and the last thing he needed was this delay. "Malik," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, "just hold on a little longer, okay? We're right here with you." Malik's hand trembled as he reached for hers, his fingers cold and weak. I don't want to die," he whispered, his voice barely audible, filled with a fear that tugged at her heart. Leah squeezed his hand gently. "You're not going to die," she said firmly, pouring all her conviction into her words. "We're going to get you to the hospital, no matter what." But even as she spoke, the sound of approaching footsteps grew louder, and she felt her anger rise. She glanced at James, who gave her a grim nod, his jaw set in determination. They both knew what was at stake, and they were ready to fight for Malik's life. The police officers reached the driver's side of the ambulance, and one of them rapped sharply on the window. James rolled it down, his expression calm but tense. "What's the rush?" the officer asked, his tone laced with suspicion as he eyed James and then glanced at Leah in the back. "We have a critical patient," James replied, his voice steady but edged with urgency. "He's in critical condition and we're trying to get him to the hospital." The officer's face remained impassive, his gaze cool and skeptical. "You know, you ran several red lights back there," he said, his tone almost conversational, as if they were discussing a minor traffic violation. James clenched his teeth, barely restraining his frustration. "Yes, because it's an emergency. This boy's life is on the line." The second officer leaned in, his gaze sharp and assessing. "We need to see some ID," he said, ignoring James's explanation. "Running lights is still against the law, emergency or not." Leah felt her anger flare and she leaned forward, her voice cold with barely controlled frustration. "Are you serious? This kid is dying, and you're worried about traffic violations?" The first officer shot her a hard look. "Watch your tone," he warned. "We're just doing our job." Leah took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She knew that escalating the situation wouldn't help Malik, and the last thing she wanted was to make things worse. James pulled out his ID, handing it over with a forced calmness that barely masked his frustration. "We're paramedics. Our job is to save lives. We're trying to get this boy to the hospital before it's too late." The officer examined the ID, his expression unchanging. "Everyone has to follow the rules," he said with a dismissive shrug. "Just because you're in an ambulance doesn't mean you can disregard the law." Leah's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to control her anger. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This was a child's life they were talking about, and yet these officers seemed more interested in exerting their authority than in understanding the gravity of the situation. "Please," she said, her voice trembling with barely restrained anger, "we don't have time for this. Malik needs medical attention right now. Every second we waste here is putting his life at risk." The second officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Maybe if you'd followed the rules, you wouldn't be in this situation," he said coolly, crossing his arms over his chest. Leah could feel her patience slipping. She wanted to scream, to demand that they let them go, but she forced herself to stay calm. She looked at Malik, who was lying on the stretcher, his eyes half closed, his breathing shallow and labored. The boy was holding on, but she could see that he was fading fast. "Look at him," she said, her voice a mixture of desperation and fury. Look at his face. He's dying. Are you really going to sit here and argue with us while this boy's life slips away?" The first officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Malik, but his face remained impassive. "We have to follow procedure," he said, though there was a hint of hesitation in his voice. "It's for everyone's safety." James's hands tightened around the steering wheel, his knuckles white with tension. He leaned forward, his voice low and filled with quiet determination. "And our job is to save lives. Right now, the only thing keeping this boy from dying is us getting him to the hospital. So please, let us do our job." The officer looked at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them. For a moment, Leah thought they might finally let them go, but the second officer only shook his head, his expression hardening. "I'm afraid we can't do that," he said firmly. "You'll have to wait here while we run your ID. It's protocol." Leah felt a surge of helplessness, a crushing sense of frustration that threatened to overwhelm her. She looked down at Malik, who was struggling to breathe, his face pale and drawn. She knew they didn't have much time left. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, a desperate plea that she knew might fall on deaf ears. "Please, he's just a kid." The first officer hesitated, his gaze flickering over Malik's frail form, but his partner remained unmoved, his expression resolute. Leah felt a surge of anger, a bitter realization that these officers cared more about their authority than about a child's life. Malik's hand trembled, and Leah reached out, holding it tightly, her heart aching as she saw the fear in his eyes. She wanted to tell him that everything would be okay, that they would get him to the hospital, but even she couldn't find the words. The tension in the ambulance was suffocating, the weight of desperation pressing down on them as they sat there, helpless. Leah could feel her own breath quicken, her anger and frustration boiling over as she watched the officers ignore the severity of the situation. She looked at James, meeting his gaze in the rearview mirror. His face was set in grim determination, his jaw clenched as he fought to control his own frustration. They both knew that Malik's life was slipping away, that every second was precious, but there was nothing they could do. Just as Leah felt herself on the verge of breaking, she noticed a small crowd gathering nearby, people watching the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording, while others whispered among themselves, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. One of the bystanders, a middle-aged woman with a fierce look of indignation, stepped forward, her voice loud and clear as she addressed the officers. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Can't you see that this boy needs help?" The officers glanced at each other, their expressions uncertain as the murmurs of the crowd grew louder. More people were joining in, their voices raised in outrage as they demanded that the paramedics be allowed to continue. "This is ridiculous," another man shouted, his voice filled with anger. "Let them do their job." The officers exchanged a look, their confidence wavering as the crowd's anger grew. The first officer looked back at Malik, his gaze softening for a brief moment, as if he was finally beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. "We're just following protocol," he mumbled, but there was no conviction in his voice. The crowd's voices grew louder and the officer shifted uncomfortably, casting a nervous glance at his partner. The second officer seemed less inclined to yield, his jaw tightening as he glared at the crowd. But as more phones were raised, recording every moment, he hesitated, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first officer sighed, stepping back from the ambulance. "All right," he said quietly, his tone grudging. "You can go. Just be careful." James didn't need to be told twice. He started the engine, his hands steady but tense as he pulled away from the curb. Leah watched the officers recede into the distance, her heart pounding with relief and anger as they sped toward the hospital. In the back, she held Malik's hand tightly, her voice a soothing murmur as she reassured him. "We're almost there, Malik. Just a little longer, and we'll get you to the hospital." Malik's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused but filled with gratitude. He gave her a faint, trembling smile, and Leah felt a surge of determination. They had come so close to losing him, but they weren't giving up. Not now. Not ever. As they pulled into the emergency bay, Leah knew that this battle was just one of many they would face. But for Malik, for the lives they fought to save, they would keep going, no matter what obstacles stood in their way. The ambulance screeched to a halt in the hospital's emergency bay, but Leah's heart was still racing, her mind clouded with anger and frustration. The confrontation with the police had drained her, leaving a bitter taste of helplessness in her mouth. As she jumped out of the ambulance and moved to Malik's side, she could still see the faces of those officers, indifferent, dismissive, more concerned with enforcing protocol than saving a life. James joined her, his face a tight mask of determination as he helped maneuver Malik's stretcher out of the ambulance. His movements were quick but careful, each step measured to ensure Malik remained stable. As they wheeled him toward the emergency room doors, Leah glanced down at Malik's pale face, his eyes half closed, his breathing weak but steady. "We're here, Malik," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "You're going to be all right now." Malik's gaze flickered, his lips moving in a faint attempt at a smile. Leah felt a surge of relief, tempered by the anger still simmering in her chest. She forced herself to stay focused, to keep her emotions in check. Right now, the only thing that mattered was getting Malik the care he needed. As they pushed through the emergency room doors, a team of doctors and nurses rushed to meet them, taking over with swift efficiency. Leah gave them a quick rundown of Malik's condition, her words clipped and precise as she relayed the details. She knew the doctors would do everything they could to save him, but the memory of the delay gnawed at her, a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing him. Once Malik was in the hands of the medical team, Leah and James stepped back, watching as he was wheeled into the trauma room. Leah's hands trembled slightly, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the frustration lingered, refusing to fade. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze steady and reassuring. "We did our best, Leah," he said quietly. "He's in good hands now." Leah nodded, but her jaw was clenched, her thoughts still racing. "It shouldn't have been like this," she muttered. "Those officers, they didn't care. They treated us like we were criminals, like we were breaking the law just to break it." James's face darkened, a flicker of anger in his usually calm eyes. "Some people can't see beyond their own authority," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "They don't understand what it's like to hold someone's life in your hands, to know that every second matters." Leah felt her frustration deepen, the memory of the officer's cold indifference replaying in her mind. She had faced plenty of challenges in her career: difficult patients, grueling shifts, the emotional toll of witnessing so much pain and suffering. But nothing compared to the helpless rage she had felt in that moment, when the people who were supposed to protect and serve had instead become an obstacle. "They didn't even listen," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They looked at us like we were lying, like we were just making excuses to get out of a ticket." James's hand tightened on her shoulder, his expression hardening. "This isn't the first time, Leah," he said quietly. "You know that. We've both seen it before. The way people look at us, the way they question our motives, our abilities. It's just worse when it comes from those who are supposed to be on our side." Leah closed her eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over her. She knew James was right. They had both faced prejudice and suspicion, both as paramedics and as individuals, and they had learned to live with it, to push through it for the sake of their patients. But this felt different, more personal. The thought that they had almost lost Malik because of someone else's unwillingness to trust them was a bitter pill to swallow. I don't understand," she said softly, her voice barely audible. "How can people be so blind, so unwilling to see the truth?" James shook his head, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Fear, maybe, or ignorance, or maybe they just don't care as much as they should. Whatever the reason, it's not going to change overnight." Leah nodded slowly, though her heart rebelled against his words. She wanted to believe that things could be different, that people could learn to see beyond their biases, to trust each other and work together for the greater good. But moments like this reminded her of how far they still had to go. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise and chaos of the emergency room fading into the background as they grappled with their emotions. Leah could feel the weight of the day pressing down on her, a bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. She knew that this wasn't just about Malik, or the police, or even the job. It was about something deeper, a sense of injustice that had followed her throughout her life, a constant reminder of the battles she still had to fight. After a while, a nurse approached them, her expression sympathetic. "Malik's stabilized," she said, her voice gentle. "The doctors are optimistic. You got him here just in time." Leah felt a surge of relief, a weight lifting from her chest. She managed a small smile, though the exhaustion still lingered in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. The nurse nodded, her gaze understanding. "You two did good work today. Not everyone could have handled it the way you did." James gave a small, grateful nod, but Leah's smile faded as the reality of the situation sank in. They had saved Malik, yes, but the experience had left a mark on her, a reminder of the challenges they still faced. As the nurse walked away, Leah turned to James, her expression determined. "We can't let this go, James," she said, her voice firm. "People need to know what happened, what we went through. If we don't speak up, it'll just keep happening." James hesitated, his brow furrowed as he considered her words. "I get it, Leah, I do. But you know how things are. People might not want to hear it. They might see it as us complaining, or worse, as us trying to blame others." Leah's jaw tightened, her gaze fierce. "Maybe. But if we stay silent, nothing will ever change. We owe it to Malik, to every patient we've ever helped, to make sure people understand what it's like to do this job, to save lives despite the obstacles people throw in our way." James studied her for a moment, his eyes filled with a mixture of respect and resignation. He knew Leah well enough to understand that once she set her mind on something, there was no stopping her, and he shared her frustration, her desire for change. They had both sacrificed so much for this job, had faced more than their fair share of challenges. Maybe it was time to finally speak out. "All right," he said softly, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "I'm with you, Leah. Whatever you need, I'm here." Leah felt a surge of gratitude, a warmth that eased the tension in her chest. She knew that this was just the beginning, that speaking up would come with its own set of challenges. But she was ready. For Malik, for herself, and for everyone who had ever been dismissed or disregarded, she was ready to fight. They stood together in the hospital corridor, a quiet resolve settling over them as they prepared for the next steps. The confrontation with the police had shaken them, but it had also strengthened their bond, deepened their commitment to their work and to each other. As they turned to leave, Leah glanced back toward the trauma room where Malik was resting, his life saved by their determination and resilience. She knew that they couldn't save everyone, couldn't change the world overnight. But in that moment, she felt a glimmer of hope, a sense of purpose that made all the pain and struggle worthwhile. They walked out of the hospital side by side, ready to face whatever came next. And as they stepped into the night, their hearts filled with a fierce resolve, they knew that their fight was far from over. The next few hours passed in a blur. Leah and James watched through the hospital window as the doctors worked with quiet intensity, stabilizing Malik and tending to his injuries. Despite the exhaustion gnawing at her bones, Leah couldn't pull herself away. The relief of knowing that Malik had made it to the hospital in time, that he was alive because they had fought for him, was a balm for her frayed nerves. The hospital staff moved with a practiced calm, each one focused and intent. Leah found herself mesmerized by the team's efficiency and dedication, but beneath her gratitude, a lingering frustration remained, a reminder of the obstacles they had faced on the way here. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the trauma room, her face set in a calm, reassuring expression. Leah and James both straightened, waiting with bated breath as she approached. "He's stable," the doctor said softly, her words like a gentle salve. "He's resting now, but he's going to need some time to recover. You both did everything right. If you hadn't gotten him here when you did—" She let the sentence trail off, the implications clear. Leah felt a wave of relief wash over her, her shoulders sagging as the tension drained away. She exchanged a look with James, a silent moment of shared gratitude and exhaustion. They had done it. Malik was alive, and that was all that mattered. "Thank you," Leah managed, her voice hoarse with emotion. The doctor nodded, offering them a small, sympathetic smile before disappearing back into the maze of hospital corridors. For a few minutes, Leah and James stood in silence, absorbing the enormity of what they had just been through. Leah could still feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, a reminder of the urgency that had propelled them forward. But now that it was over, a different kind of exhaustion settled over her, a bone-deep weariness that made her want to sink to the floor and close her eyes. "Let's sit for a minute," James murmured, gesturing to a row of chairs along the hallway. Leah nodded, grateful for the suggestion, and they both collapsed onto the seats, letting the weight of the day settle over them. The hospital was quiet, the kind of stillness that only came in the late hours of the night. Leah glanced around, taking in the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the muted sounds of doctors and nurses moving through the halls. It was a far cry from the chaos of the ambulance, the relentless urgency of the streets. Here, there was a strange peace, a sense of finality. But even in the calm, Leah couldn't shake the memory of what had happened. The confrontation with the police replayed in her mind, the officers' indifferent faces, their dismissive tone. She had never felt so helpless, so furious. It was a reminder of the barriers they faced every day, the systemic flaws that placed protocol above people, rules above lives. James seemed to sense her thoughts. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he let out a long, weary sigh. "This isn't right, Leah," he said softly. "We shouldn't have had to go through that. Malik shouldn't have had to suffer because of someone else's pride." Leah nodded, her jaw clenched as she stared at the floor. "They didn't care, James. They saw us as something less. It's like our words didn't matter, like Malik's life didn't matter. They were more concerned with proving a point than saving a life." James was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point down the hallway. "It makes me wonder," he said quietly, "how many people have been hurt because of that same attitude? How many lives have been lost because someone chose rules over humanity?" Leah felt a pang in her chest, a familiar ache that came with the realization of how far they still had to go. "Too many," she whispered, "and it won't stop unless people start speaking out, unless they see what's really happening." She could see the weariness in James's eyes, a reflection of her own frustration and anger. They had both dedicated their lives to this work, had sacrificed their time, their energy, their emotional well-being to save others. But in moments like this, it felt like they were fighting a losing battle, like their efforts were swallowed up by a system that refused to see the people they were trying to protect. A gentle cough interrupted their thoughts, and they looked up to see a small group of hospital staff gathered nearby, their faces sympathetic. Some were nurses they recognized, others were doctors they'd worked alongside during emergencies. They looked at Leah and James with quiet understanding, their expressions a mixture of admiration and shared frustration. One of the nurses stepped forward, a woman named Carla, whom Leah had worked with before. Her eyes were kind but tired, a reflection of the countless nights she'd spent tending to patients in these very halls. "We heard about what happened," Carla said softly, her voice filled with empathy. It's not right what you went through. You deserve better than that." Leah felt a lump form in her throat, and she managed a small nod, her heart swelling with gratitude. It was a relief to know that they weren't alone, that there were others who understood the challenges they faced, who shared in their frustration and their determination to make things better. Another doctor, a man with graying hair and a weary smile, added, "You two did an incredible job today. Malik's family is lucky to have you, and so are we." Leah exchanged a glance with James, a silent acknowledgement of the support they were receiving. It wasn't often that they were recognized, that their efforts were truly seen. But in this moment, surrounded by colleagues who understood, she felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder of why she had chosen this path. "We're just doing our jobs," Leah said quietly, though the words felt hollow. She knew that it was more than that this job demanded a part of herself that few could understand. Carla nodded, her gaze steady. "And you're doing it better than most. Just know that we're here for you, if there's anything you need, if you want to talk, or even if you want to take this further to make sure people know what happened, we'll support you." Leah felt a surge of gratitude, her anger softening into something gentler, something more hopeful. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to know we're not alone." As the hospital staff drifted back to their duties, Leah and James were left in a comfortable silence, the weight of the day's events gradually easing. They both knew that there was still work to be done, that Malik's story, their story, needed to be told. But for now they were content to sit in the quiet, letting the exhaustion settle over them like a blanket. After a while, James broke the silence, his voice soft, but filled with a quiet determination. "Leah, we should talk to someone. Take this to the right people. What happened tonight, it can't happen again." Leah looked at him, seeing the resolve in his eyes, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. "You're right," she said, her voice steady. "We can't stay silent. For Malik, and for everyone else who's been through this, we have to speak up." James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "We'll do it together then. We'll make sure people know what really happened, and we'll fight to make sure it doesn't happen again." Leah felt a warmth spread through her, a fierce pride in the bond they shared, in the determination that had brought them to this moment. They had faced obstacles, had been tested in ways they hadn't anticipated, but they had come out stronger, united by a shared commitment to their work and to each other. As they rose from their seats and made their way out of the hospital, Leah felt a renewed sense of hope, a belief that change was possible, that their voices could make a difference. Malik's story, their story, was just beginning, and they were ready to fight for a future where every life was valued, where every person had the chance to be heard. And as they stepped into the quiet night, Leah knew that they would keep fighting, together, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Thank you for watching this episode. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and check out our other videos. Write in the comments where you're watching from. See you in the next episodes.